So hi, I'm Tim. So initially this talk that you see was broken up into two chunks. I'm only going to do a very small part of the first chunk. The second chunk was given by this wonderful guy here named John Avila, who is somewhat occluded by the cart. Punchline on me. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know it is difficult to believe with this radiantly beautiful, youthful face that you see. But I actually started this out of a dorm room at Stanford back in 1999. So I have gone through the entire entrepreneur's journey. Started a company. I have seen that company fail. I have resurrected that company, and I have built it up with a team of really, really compelling folks to where it's at now. So I've been through the whole thing. I got some cool stuff along the way. Worked with lots of organizations on that. I got to meet, or I got an award from the White House, which is kind of cool. It was the White House you wanted to get an award from, which is kind of nice. But I've actually been in the business for a long time. Where I am useful to you, I know a lot about how the business of digital accessibility works, and I know a lot about how you implement that at a particular degree of scale. And I understand how that intersects with what I would call the legal and regulatory environment. So I am reasonably considered probably an expert in those three different dimensions, which is running a business in this space. How does that business actually effectuate itself to solutions for customers? And then also, how does that actually work in the legal and regulatory framework? I have slides. They have an agenda associated with them and all of that. But I'm known for kind of going off script and wandering around. So I would say let's do 35, 40 minutes of slide stuff. And then let's just go into questions. I'm a huge fan too of questions as they come, as they pop into your mind. You can raise your hand if you want. You can yell loudly if you would like to yell loudly. Yeah, so if you decide to yell wildly at me or raise your hand, I will repeat the question such that it is actually communicated on the live stream. You can also go over and get the wireless mic as well. So that's it. So a couple things we talk about tonight. One is just kind of big picture. I'd say let's take it back a notch and just think about the market that we are in as digital accessibility experts and how that plays out over the course of 10, 20, 30, 50 years. Let's focus in then on the legal environment so you get a little bit of a sense of what is actually driving the market in the short term. Why do people care about digital accessibility? Not just because it's a good thing to do, but also the actual legal drivers associated with that. And then I'll do a little bit to the extent it makes sense on market access, and then a little bit on program maturity, and kind of go from there. Make sense? Cool. All right, let's go totally in a different direction. Let's start off with a little exercise. So take out your cell phone, hold it up in the air. Joey, do you not have a cell phone? Sorry, Joey and I go way back, so I'll occasionally reference her. All right, take your cell phone and hand it to the person next to you. If you're at the end of the row, hand it to the person behind you. Just get rid of your cell phone. I'll go ahead and hand my cell phone to you. You hold my cell phone and Joey. Hold on. Okay. So first, the person holding the cell phone, you're holding somebody else. How do you feel holding out somebody else's cell phone? Heavy. It's a little weird, complicated, it's a little bit out there. Now, the more interesting question is how do you feel that someone else is holding your cell phone? I feel like it's a little weird too. You feel fine. That's good. Just mental exercise. If we keep doing this for 5 minutes, how awkward will this be? It'll feel really bad. I've got something that's yours, and I shouldn't have this, and it's a key part of your life. And how do you feel if I take your cell phone away from you? What would happen if I threw it out the window? They feel bad. So now you can hand your cell phone back. I don't know how it works. We got confused up here. So super simple illustration of one fact. Technology is important in your life. And at a very, very fundamental level, what we would tell you is if technology is important in your life, access to technology is critically important. And ultimately, there are three things you strive to do in life. You strive to earn, you strive to learn, you strive to belong. Earning, can you make a living? Can you do something that's productive in society? Learning, can you educate, can you grow, can you develop? Belong, can you have a sense of community? Those three things, those fundamental, I would tell you they're human rights. You can argue if they're civil rights or human rights separately. Those three things are critical, and they're constantly mediated by technology, and they will be more mediated by technology for the rest of our lives. So for the rest of our lives, these devices, computers, they will play a bigger and bigger role in our life. And so the first thing I would tell you is, we as an industry, a digital accessibility industry, we should challenge ourselves to something a little bit bigger than just digital accessibility. We should challenge ourselves to general access to technology. And it's my belief that as an industry, we should say that access to technology is a fundamental right of human beings. Again, civil right, human right, you can define it, but like, this is how we live. And if you don't have access to technology, that is a profound negative force in your life. In the same vein, if you do have access to technology, it is a profoundly empowering force in your life. So the first thing I would challenge you with tonight is that we should raise the discussion to generally say in our industry, in digital accessibility, that we're going to take a stance as an industry that access to technology is critical, and we should be intolerant in discrimination of any kind in access to technology. We have chosen, from a professional perspective, to work in the area of access for people with disabilities, but fundamentally we should take the stance that access to technology is important, and we should try to ensure that it is equivalent for all people. And ultimately, if you just back it up a touch and you wonder what the heck is level access about and what are we trying to do, it's our belief that at a fundamental level, you live your fullest life in today's society via access to technology. You don't get to live up to your full potential without access to technology. So you can argue that. It's a great debate. I would encourage you to have it. But at a fundamental level, we think that's true. And if you think that's true, then the next step is, where can you have the most impact? And we believe the biggest impact that you can have in this day and age, in particular based on where we're at as a company, as a group of people, is via access to technology for people with disabilities. So that's a framework for what we do as a company. And ultimately what I would say, if that sounds interesting to you, and that is something that you think makes sense and aligns with what you want to do with your life, that's a good thing to come join Level Access team, like be in digital accessibility, whatever you want. Like, we're the core of that. The industry is broader than that, and that's what should bring you into the industry as a whole. Make sense? Okay. So that's as abstract as I'm going to get. Now I'm going to get like super detailed and technical from there. All right. So let's take it back a notch and talk about big picture. So why do we care about digital accessibility? So Joey and I knew this hundreds of years ago because we're just brilliant and smart folks. Glad you guys caught up with us. But here's the deal. This industry will be a dominant industry for the rest of our professional careers. I would argue for the rest of our lives at this point. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But at a fundamental level, what will continue to drive digital accessibility more or less for the rest of our lives is the fact that the demographic structure of the population is changing, and it is changing in a way that demands more accessibility from information and communication resources, from technology resources. So you'll see a bunch of different trends on this. There's a bunch of different data you can pull. But basically, two things are happening. As a society, we are having less children, and as a society, we are living longer. And this data plays out the same way in developing economy world. Developed economy world. It is more exacerbated in developed economy worlds. Interestingly enough, in Japan, it's actually like further along in the process. So you can actually see an aged economy if you actually look at Japan. But basically, the punchline is more and more of the population will be older on average. And more of that population will actually use technology as a critical and core part of their day-to-day life. Left unsaid is also the fact that that chunk of the population actually votes at a more rapid rate, or sort of a higher incidence rate than the rest of the population. These trends are unlikely to change in the next 30 to 50 years. So you will see more of the population get older. The reason you care about that is there is an almost perfect correlation between age and the incidence rate of disability. So as we all get older, on average, we have more disabilities, pro rata and a portion of the population. You can see as you get older, that actually crosses a point where it's even over 50% of the population. Interestingly enough, there's also a subthread in this, which is to say that people that get older will also not necessarily identify as individuals with disabilities, but will definitely use accessibility features of technology. As an example, my parents would not say, I have a disability. They would not self-identify as that, but they certainly use accessibility features on their phone when they magnify the text that are on their phone, when they yell at Siri, Siri, goddammit, like whatever the heck they're doing. Like, those are all features of accessibility, and those are things we impact. So those societal trends will not change and will continue to drive this for the rest of our careers. So good job. You picked a good domain space. If we then think about that a little bit further in terms of where is the population at, there is a demand for digital experiences that has continued to grow on a generational basis. So I'm kind of barely in Gen X, I'm kind of in Gen Y, and then you have digital natives. And you can see the density of screens continues to increase across all of those different generations. Particularly when we look at Generation Z, people call them millennials is probably the more common term. Generation Z, I guess, is like what my parents would say about like millennials. About a quarter of the population, and mediated by screens from the time they get up throughout the rest of their life. So within 5 minutes of waking up, they got a screen in front of them and they're using it. Is anybody here a millennial? Awesome. Sorry, I'm kind of speaking about you in the third person here, so just like second person, well, you, but it's not important right now. Second person plural is very confusing too, is y'all, it's not really appropriate. More and more, though, people are actually using screens to interact in all of these different aspects of society. Again, sort of earn, learn, and belong. And all of those things are mediated by screens. So the question from a Gen X perspective, the question from a Gen Y perspective is already like, well, like, are we mediated by screens? Like, how does it work? Digital natives, folks that are like ahead of us from a generation perspective, like, it's all screens all the time. And if we don't have access to technology, you are totally shut out in this. And I would actually argue first you're shut out from belonging, from societal interactions and meaningful interactions with your peers. And then the fact that you're also shut out from earning opportunities and learning opportunities is actually kind of a secondary consideration in some respects. And we can argue about that and debate that, but that's actually the most radical implication there. So you look at that generation and they expect technology to work. It works all the time. It works across multiple devices, and it should be accessible or usable in all of the different spheres of life that they have. Another big long-term trend we see is that commerce in general is no longer tied to any one physical location. So the era when I went to a store and I purchased something is basically dead at this point. Already about 10+% of the retail commerce is executed online. There's weird data here. You'll see some data here that I'm quoting is about 9%. You'll see some data quoting this as high as 13%. It's the same data. It's just whether or not you pull out sort of core retail spending versus exceptional retail spending. It's sort of irrelevant, which is to say we continuously see more and more spending going online. And the criticality of being able to buy things online, we'll talk about a little bit later on when we talk about price differences between online and off. But essentially, you're spending your money online. We expect to be able to spend money online. You also expect that experience to be integrated with the technology that you have. So you take it for granted that now you can walk into Starbucks and you can charge your Starbucks on your phone, and that is an integrated experience. You take it for granted that there is geofencing on your phone when you walk past a retailer that tells you that you should come in. And so the point here that's particularly critical from a legal perspective is the physical experience is tied to the digital experience in an inextricable way. It is very difficult to pull those two experiences apart as a consumer that is consuming goods or services from a particular location. And that has some pretty material impacts when we think about the legal implications, particularly here in the United States market, which is to say it is inextricable to pull apart an online experience from a physical experience in a store, because all of these things are driven more towards omni-channel commerce. So the trend towards omni-channel commerce, the combination of your digital experience with your in-store experience, is unlikely to change based on super big demographic kind of features and how people expect to shop. And that actually has a legal implication when you look at the ADA. Make sense so far? Interestingly enough, we had a question down here that you can't see, which is more and more mobile experience is tied into shopping. And so one of the questions we asked on the slide is, will plaintiffs' attorneys do the same thing? And this was a abstract theoretical question about a month ago and is no longer an abstract theoretical question. They actually did the same thing, so they followed that. All right, so this one I think is particularly fascinating. If you say that an in-store physical experience that is accessible to people with disabilities is enough and that an online experience is not needed, that assumes there is a correlation between these two experiences, right? That a person with disabilities who can't access a website can go into a store, and that is a reasonable correlation of experiences. That argument is crazy, so don't buy that, but just that argument has been made. So one of the interesting questions in that is, okay, cool, let's buy for a second that that's a similar experience. Is that actually economically the same experience? And so one of the fascinating things that the data actually tells you is that that is actually not economically the same experience. That if you don't have access to online stores, you are at a pricing disadvantage. Another way to say that is if you are forced to go to a physical store to buy goods, on average, you will pay about 2% more than you would if you're actually in an online store associated with that. And so this is basically the consumer prices for products. And what you're seeing is offline products have dropped about 1% from Q1 2016 to Q1 2018. Online products have dropped 3%. And this is on a inflation-adjusted basis, which tells you that online stores are cheaper or their prices are decreasing faster than offline physical stores. Now, the thesis on this is that there is more competition online. I would buy that thesis. It's difficult to tease apart causality on that. But basically what we do know is that because there is more competition online, pricing pressure is greater online, and it tends to drive down prices faster on an inflation-adjusted basis. So then you would ask the question of, if you don't have access to online stores, are you economically disadvantaged? And generally the answer to that question, I would tell you, from the data, would probably be yes. Make sense? Cool. I don't know if y'all signed up for a really data-driven talk, but I'm a big data person, so that's it. Cool data on this one is actually from an Adobe report. So Adobe actually studies this stuff and released a lot of the data there. One of the other cool things that we see is accessible interactive games. I won't get as deeply into this, but how many people are like huge fans of the FCC in here? Exactly. No one raised. You kind of raise your hand. FCC promulgates a chunk of legislation called the 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act. If you have heard of it, good for you. If you haven't heard of it, there's absolutely no shame in that. It's random. It is such a deep in the weeds like chunk of requirements, and it will have such a positive impact on the accessibility of technology that you will never know. Punchline is basically this law and then the set of regulations associated with it governs any human-to-human interaction that goes over the internet. So as an example, our live stream would be covered by this right now because I'm communicating with other humans over the internet. And so essentially one of the things that's covered in this, which is very subtle but is very clear in the actual regulations, is in fact video games. So if you are playing video games online and you can chat with your friends, that is covered under the CVAA and needs to be accessible. So the video game industry had exemptions to this to make the numbers simple, about 3 years. Those exemptions ended on January 1, and so now you will see video games becoming accessible. And basically the reasoning for that, or the combination of that, is the chat feature in the video game needs to be accessible, and then the path to get to that chat feature. The reason this is interesting is just the sheer number of people that use video games is ridiculous. Like, well over half of the US population uses video games. Some absurd amount of the population actually has full-on console gaming solutions that they have. So there's actually a pretty good argument that video games will be one of the most accessible platforms available for people with disabilities to access technology. The more interesting thing is just societally, a lot of people interact through games. And this was actually brought home to me. There's this guy, Mark Barley, who runs this organization. Where is it? Able Gamers. And he was like, yeah, I go to hang out with my friends online in games. And he's like, and if I have a disability and I can't do that, that sucks. And I was like, that sucks. That's terrible. You're right. And so interestingly enough, that's also just kind of knit into the societal framework that we have now. And so ensuring people have access to that we think is pretty critical. So cool stuff on accessible interactive games. In addition, what I would just tell you is like the nature of regulatory oversight for technology is kind of shifting. So over the last, I would say 20, 25 plus years, the regulatory view has been technology is inherently good. Let technology companies run and do their own thing. We're kind of starting to see that shift now. You've already seen it shift in the EU, where there's much more skepticism about the control of information in particularly large technology firms. My expectation is you'll probably end up seeing that kind of shift a little bit in the US, although probably not quite as much as in the EU. And so we would just say like that trend seems to align with more regulation for digital accessibility. I don't think you will see that in the current administration, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to say that if we're going to hold large technology firms accountable for their use of our personal information, we should also hold them accountable for the degree of access that they provide to individuals with disabilities or really anyone in terms of having access to that technology. So we don't know about that. That's a little bit of a flyer, but we're interested to see where that goes. One of the ones that's slightly more interesting to us, though, is that work is shifting as well. So the way that a lot of us get jobs has probably changed. This would be interesting, actually. How many people in here do part-time work or contract as a primary living? Yeah. So we're actually about below the average in the population. So right now, there's something like 50 odd million. Yeah, so about 56.7 million Americans do freelance work out of the actual working population. More and more, we don't, as a society, particularly in America, we don't necessarily buy that we're going to work at the same place 40 hours a week and that's going to be it. People more and more cobble careers together and do various different things. And what's interesting is they access these opportunities through technology platforms. And so when they go in and they figure out, well, how am I going to get my next contracting gig? They go onto an online platform. If you're a driver, you're like, hey, I'm going to be on Uber or I'm going to be on Lyft. And so there's this fascinating thread of people more and more access like sort of transactional work environments. And does that transactional work environment, is that transactional work environment accessible? And if it's not accessible, almost definitionally, you are excluding people from work opportunities. Now, we can have a wondrous and robust debate about whether or not those are employment opportunities or if they are contracting opportunities, but just kind of leaving that thing aside. The idea is your work is more and more mediated by digital platforms, and we want to make sure that those digital platforms provide access to individuals with disabilities. And then I'll wrap up on this, which is to say, ultimately, learning is also changing. So the way that you learn is more and more bite-sized, it's more and more video-based, and it's more and more self-directed. And this is particularly prevalent if you are actually a self-employed individual. So this concept that you're going to go and you're going to get like a 4-year degree and you're going to stay at college and do all these things, like that still happens, but less and less of education is about that. More and more of education is self-directed, online, and driven by platforms that you have access to. So we were talking about earning in the last slide. This is about learning in this slide, which is this idea of if I don't have access to those platforms, how am I going to be able to continue to learn at a particular rate? All right, everybody still good so far? Phones ringing. Classic Joey. It works. Good? Okay. I don't know. Sometimes people in the back, they're like, their eyes are glazed over. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about the legal environment and what's actually happening with the law right now. So you have heard a widely quoted statistic that there are at least 2,258 digital accessibility cases filed in 2018. That statistic is from a firm called Cypress Shaw. Cypress Shaw operates a website, ADA Title III. That is a good chunk of data. They actually have the backing on that, and basically what they have done is they've gone in and profiled cases that are filed under ADA Title III in federal court, and then they have rendered that actual number. They do that via, I'm going to forget the name, Pacer is actually the system that uses that. So pretty good number. That number is also growing at a ridiculous rate, and I will argue hopefully persuasively based on the data that that number will continue to grow. The state of the law is that you get different judges in different cases and you get different rulings. You don't really have a ton of precedent. There's a potential we'll get some more precedent on a Dominos case that we'll talk about in a bit. But basically 99.9% of these cases settle. Very few actually go to trial. And so you don't actually have a lot of case law relative to the number of cases. In addition, the precursor to lawsuits, which is the number that's reported here, here is demand letters or threats of litigation. Those are not publicly available. And so the expectation is actually there's probably a significant multiplier on top of this. I would guess that it's probably 4 or 5x. So there's probably more like 10,000 actions in this, which is to say there is a material number of actions driving enforcement in this space. You can see a couple different things around this. We're starting to get some appellate decisions, but that's still relatively early. So one disclaimer point here. I am not an attorney. This is from someone that is a technical expert in this space and has read these decisions. These were prepped by attorneys, but I cannot provide you legal advice. I have no desire to do so. So if you need an attorney, go get one. We're happy to give you some recommendations. Couple cool developments. So there's this case called Robles versus Domino Pizza. You probably know Domino's Pizza. Basically, Robles says, look, your website and your mobile apps are not accessible. And the punchline on that is Domino's goes and says, look, you can't actually sue us because the DOJ has not made specific regulations for this. The district court, which is the lowest court, dismisses it. It goes up to the circuit court, and the circuit court is like, this is ridiculous. Just because we don't have regulations doesn't mean the law doesn't apply. We as a court are perfectly capable of making a determination in these areas of ambiguity. That is, in fact, what courts do. And so we are happy to actually say that this law, in fact, applies and pushes it back down to the district court to figure out what is actually going on in the case. This is actually probably going to get appealed to this Supreme Court, which will be fascinating to see if the Supreme Court actually takes it, and then if they do, what the rendering on it is. What is interesting, though, is the takeaway as it currently stands in the law is that the ADA applies even if there aren't regulations that have been issued by the DOJ. There's a slightly more subtle version of this, which we'll talk about in a second, about, let me see if I have a slide on it. Let's talk about it here. We'll talk about the implication of WCAG on these things. A couple other interesting decisions in the 11th Circuit Court. So the 11th Circuit Court, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. This is Haynes versus Hooters of America. It is that Hooters. This is true. And actually, the plaintiff actually sued him. Punchline here is basically they dismissed this Hooters case in the district court because they had said Hooters is getting sued. They have settled another case that is a web accessibility case. It came up to the district court. The district court, Hooters argued, look, we settled this thing. Like, you can't hold us accountable for another lawsuit because we've already settled one. And the district court is like, that doesn't make sense because A, this settlement can't be enforced by this other plaintiff, and B, we don't really know what that settlement is. It's a private settlement, so like allow the case to go forward, which basically the punchline on that is if you get sued once and you settle, it has no bearing on whether or not you're going to get sued again. Interestingly enough, the data has now grown to support this. We see multiple clients being sued multiple times, and lawsuits, again, are the kind of final point in issues relating to digital accessibility. So that's Haynes versus Hooters. That's Haynes versus Hooters of America. Haynes versus Dunkin's LLC, which is the exact same plaintiff. This one's kind of interesting because we actually got a ruling that said the physical Dunkin' store and the digital Dunkin' stores don't have to be intersected for the ADA to apply. That is a concept called nexus, which is a huge consideration in how ADA law works and how the various different circuits actually rule associated with that. But that wasn't actually a published decision, so it's sort of irrelevant. So Haynes would be So the question was, who is Haynes and why are they suing multiple people? Haynes is what would be characterized, rightly or wrongly, as a serial plaintiff. And so essentially Haynes would be named as a plaintiff in multiple lawsuits. And then those lawsuits are filed. Make sense? Yeah. Rightly or wrongly. Let's argue about the ethics of this in a little bit because it's actually a fascinating topic of discussion as well. Final point, Sierra versus City of Hallandale Beach, Florida. Basically, the ideal was Hallandale Beach, Florida had video on their site, and they asked to dismiss the case because the accessibility of the video was governed by the CVAA and not by the ADA. In fact, the accessibility of the video is governed by both, and essentially what the judge allowed in that is, well, the plaintiff can choose which of these they actually want to pursue legal action under. So they can actually pursue legal action under the ADA or the CVAA. Plaintiff chose to pursue it under the ADA, and that was fine. There's a whole bunch more on that case, but it's not interesting. You were asking about the SAS case. Okay, so here's the deal. SAS, Scandinavian Airline System. Department of Transportation has promulgated regulations for the Air Carrier Access Act. Way back in 2016, they basically said, hey, look, you've got to make your websites accessible. We, the Department of Transportation, are defining accessibility after a structured process as WCAG A and AA conformant. There's a little more subtlety to it than that in terms of the chunks of the website that are covered and when they're covered over time. But basically they said, look, you got to be AA compliant. So SAS, Scandinavian Airline System, goes out and buys a solution to create an alternative website. They buy a solution... I don't know. They buy a solution from a competing company. We won't say which one. So they go out and they buy this solution and they deploy it. And it has so imagine the website, and the website has alternate site or assistive site. And you click on that and you go to this alternate site, right? Which we could argue about a lot. I would argue that is not an accessible experience. I think the regulations and the law would support me in that, but you could argue it either way. But so SAS is like, no, we're going to do it. And their vendor said it was okay. And so basically what happened here is the Department of Transportation came back after they received some complaints and they were like, no, you can't do that. You can't create an alternative site. You have to make the primary site accessible. And because you went and made an alternative site, we're going to fine you $100,000 now. You have a year to fix it. And if you don't fix it in a year, we're going to fine you another $100,000 for your trouble. So the first thing is, don't build a separate site because it's not true. It doesn't actually work and it's not accessible. The second is if you have a firm that comes to you and is in the business of building alternative sites and they're like, this alternative site is perfect. It will solve all of your legal needs and make you fully compliant. You should be skeptical of these claims. They may not be true. They are probably not in the best interest of you. There's a bunch of theory that backs this up, both from the domain space of digital accessibility as well as from the legal space as well. What's interesting in this is a first time a U.S. federal government agency has gone on record on that and actually issued a specific ruling. Does not apply to the ADA. This is not an ADA case, so it's not necessarily binding law. But again, it is the opinion of a actually legitimately promulgated regulation on digital accessibility and an agency that is tasked with governing that regulation. So that's a pretty strong opinion relative to the market. Whether or not it actually impacts the ADA is open to discussion. Outside of that, what do we see on the front for legislative and regulatory changes? To be honest, not much. There was a push to refine components of the ADA. There was this ADA Education and Reform Act of 2017. It was House Bill 620, HR 620. We predicted it would go nowhere and it would die in the Senate. It went nowhere. It died in the Senate. So yay, we got that one right. The Congress isn't going to pass anything to actually change the ADA anytime soon. So we think that's really, really unlikely to get anything passed through both houses, especially something that actually takes away rights rather than grants new rights. We do see some chipping away at that at the state level, but these are particularly with state level requirements. They can't actually impact federal requirements. And we actually see some states going more restrictive, some states going a little bit more aggressive as well. Generally, the trend is towards more restriction in terms of filing of lawsuits at the state level, but most of the lawsuits are filed federally as well. So the punchline for us would be you're probably really not going to see any changes at the federal level. Big game changers could be different rulings out of the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court takes up one of these cases first and then rules in a particular way, we may see something that material changes, but that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. With that said, what's interesting to me is always that the DOJ actually keeps saying the ADA applies to websites. They have been consistent on this point through multiple different administrations. So they actually said this in the Bush administration, they said it in the Obama administration, and they've said it in the Trump administration, which people may find shocking. But the DOJ has been very consistent that the ADA, in fact, applies to websites, and they have said this in an official capacity. Most recently, they said this under the current administration in a letter to Congress, stating that the DOJ continues to feel that Title III applies to websites. With that said, the chance that you're going to get a regulation from the DOJ is about 0%. So that's not going to happen. DOJ wrote this letter to Congress, and they basically Congress was like, DOJ, why don't you make regulations? And they're like, DOJ was like, Congress, why don't you make a law? And it was like siblings arguing. It was great. Outside of that, you're probably not going to see any DOJ enforcement. In the Obama administration, DOJ did aggressively enforce certain marquee cases in the area of digital accessibility. We have not seen that in the Trump administration. We have seen continuing enforcement of the settlements that they have in place, though. So it's not like they've abandoned the settlements. They've continued to see them through, but they're not aggressively going out and pursuing new litigation on this. We have also seen that both at the federal level and then also at the state and local level as well. So we haven't seen enforcement in either of those areas. One other point that I'll kind of frame here. We can talk about WCAG 2.1 later if people are asked about that. Right now, the legal standard, again, that's kind of in air quotes, there's no regulatory standard there, tends to still be 2.0. We do not see plaintiffs' attorneys pushing for 2.1. We do see some more leading plaintiffs' attorneys pushing for that. So we do expect the market will shift to 2.1, but the market has not shifted yet. So right now, if you're looking for a standard to adopt, it's still 2.0. With that said, there are some material reasons that you would actually go ahead and move to 2.1 as you kind of future-proof yourself, but I don't think you're going to be forced to do that by an external party at this point. Let's skip through this stuff. All right, so we talked about some of the lawsuits and enforcement and the growth associated with these lawsuits. And so our argument to you and kind of our thesis is that this enforcement is going to continue to grow. Doesn't matter if you think it's good, doesn't matter if you think it's bad. We think it's going to continue to grow, like just as a neutral statement there. And so essentially what we saw was 210% increase in 2017. And we were like, that's no way that can continue. And then it increased 177% in 2018. And so our hunch would be that it continues to grow at a pretty aggressive rate and that you will continue to see more and more litigation in this space. The reason that we think that is the case is ultimately a supply and demand calculation. And so this is our data. This is not Cypher Shaw's data. But basically, if you look at the top 20 plaintiff firms that are out there, those plaintiff firms accounted for 87% of all of the lawsuits that were filed. So 20 firms accounted for 80% of the 2,258 lawsuits that were out there. There are potentially hundreds of firms that can file lawsuits in this space. So if you think of lawsuits as a supply, the supply of lawsuits is unlikely to be tapped out at any time soon. And we see a huge number of lawsuits in a small number of firms. So the logical thesis is, well, if that number of lawsuits expands to the rest of the firms on average, how many will we get? And the answer is a lot more than we have now. Now, one ethical side note here, and this is Tim Springer talking, not Level Access talking. I don't know if you think these lawsuits are good things or bad things. People will say they're trolls, they're terrible, they're drive-by lawsuits. Like, there's a whole bunch of arguments about them being bad. People that say that they're driving these lawsuits or doing it as an advocacy perspective, they're good. I don't know if they're good or bad. I can tell you that they're here. I can also tell you I've been in this business for 20 years, and this issue is 1,000 times more prevalent now because of the lawsuits. So I don't know if they're good or bad ways to drive societal change, but I can tell you as a totally neutral fact, this is changing the discussion in digital accessibility. So whether or not you think they're good or bad, I can tell you it has changed things, and I would argue it has drastically increased the level of awareness that we actually have of digital accessibility at the industry level. So that's great. Tim, how do I avoid these lawsuits? So the first thing you do is you get a analytics package like Access Analytics or a scanning tool like AMP. Those are both products that we manufacture, if you don't know. Basically, the way these lawsuits mechanically work is you have a plaintiff's firm. They pick an industry. They go through everyone in the industry, almost literally from A to Z. They run a scanning tool like AMP, which is a tool that we manufacture, but it's basically a tool that goes out and scans the web pages, finds technical errors with accessibility, which I would say are syntax errors of accessibility. They take that data, they stick it in what is called a demand letter, and then they send it to you, and then they see what happens. And if you respond, they negotiate and settle with you for a couple $1,000. And if you don't respond, they go to the court and they file a lawsuit. And then they wait for you to respond, because the chances that you will settle that lawsuit are 99.9%, because it makes no sense for you to litigate it. The reason it makes no sense for you to litigate it is if you haven't materially invested in digital accessibility, you are probably inaccessible, just as a general factual statement, independent of any particular website. So the point that I would give you here is that whether or not you think automated scanning tools are good and are a key part of the accessibility lifecycle, I would argue pretty strongly they are, and they're actually quite useful. That is what drives a lot of litigation. And so one of the key things you want to do is make sure that your website scans cleanly. That if we were to run an automated testing tool on it, it has a minimum number of violations, and that we have addressed those violations in an appropriate fashion throughout our software development lifecycle. Finally, then the question becomes, okay, where are these lawsuits happening? What chunks of the industry are there? This is the smallest print that I could possibly fit on this page, so thankfully you can download these slides. The punchline here is pretty simple. If it has to do with consumers and it has to do with a physical location, it has high risk. So all of the industries we see with a lot of digital accessibility litigation basically fit that profile, and the combination of that profile is particularly litigious. So the retail industry is the number one space, because that has to do with general consumers, and it has to do with physical locations, and basically from a legal perspective and from a overarching sort of risk perspective, those are broadly intertwined. In the same vein, electronics manufacturers do not face as much risk because they're manufacturing electronics in a warehouse and wherever the heck, right? So not a physical location, et cetera. But the places that sell those electronics are actually quite liable. So that is a drastic oversimplification of where we actually see the data coming out. Numbers are from what year? This would be, let's see, we probably pulled this data back in January for the trailing 6-month period.
Is that relationship due to the nexus?
So the first question was, when did we pull the data from? And the answer to that was we pulled it from basically about January back about 6 months.
Is that relationship or... Testing, 1, 2. Is the reason for the association with a physical place due to that nexus issue?
I would argue
which
it is.
can potentially change over time to the point that you brought up earlier?
Yeah, I would argue it is. So the question is about the nexus issue, which is basically the combination of your digital store and your physical footprint. And the tighter that combination is, to oversimplify, the stronger sort of the law arguments are that you have to comply. And I would argue, yes, they're easy targets in a lot of different jurisdictions.
What happens if you get a demand, but you have already, you're already working with a vendor to make your site accessible?
You get to settle another lawsuit, potentially. It doesn't matter. So it really comes down to the plaintiff and then the level of accessibility that you have on the site. So you basically have two options. Again, this is a great question for an attorney, so I'm just giving you kind of my cheap seats view. But essentially the calculus most customers have is, if the site itself is not accessible, independent of whether or not you're working with someone, the site is not accessible. That is a fact of the situation. And so ultimately, there is arguably a good claim to say that you are not providing effective communication through that website for people with disabilities. And then and that's what the facts would turn on. And so you have the option of saying, well, look, we're working with someone else, but the fact is it's still not accessible. And so generally most people in that situation would settle. Now, whether or not you want to fight it out, et cetera, is open discussion. But broadly, if you go back to kind of the case we were referencing before, the stance that just because you've settled another one doesn't mean you're protected kind of applies there as well. But it doesn't matter. Until it's actually accessible, I would say you probably don't actually fight the situation. Okay. A couple of the takeaways I would give you here. Multiple lawsuits or demand letters against a single organization. That's common, and you should expect that to be more of the case going forward. So if you work for a large organization that has a relatively well-known brand, you will be hit multiple times in a year in the relative future if you are not already. We have multiple organizations that have settled not one, not two, but 5 to 6 of these, and larger companies settle these as a matter of course. You can defend yourself, but ultimately you have to defend yourselves on the facts, and that is a difficult thing, and then will actually require you to spend money to defend yourself. So broader discussion about what you want to do. Again, factually, I could tell you the data indicates this is not going away, and you should expect it to get materially worse. And the absence of a regulation does not actually give you any definition of safe harbor. Your only safe harbor is this definition of effective communication, which we can talk about if people want. We have seen leading multi-brand entities being targeted multiple times as well, which is nothing more complicated than to say if you own 10 companies or 10 separate brands in one holding company, you have 10 points of risk, not 1 point of risk. So your legal structure is irrelevant. It's the number of things that are exposed to the consumer that tends to actually drive the risk. So as an example, we have clients that have 155 brands. They have 155 individual points of risk, not 1 point of risk because they're a single legal entity. One thing I would also flag to you is expertise does in fact count in this space. GNC recently lost a case, I guess if you could say that, but basically had the testimony of their expert thrown out because their expert was not actually an expert in digital accessibility. They were an expert in IT, which I don't really ever know what IT means. But basically, if you go into court, like you actually have to have a person that knows what they're talking about. I would also counsel you to have a person that understands how to speak attorney, because the relationship between the attorney and the technical expert is particularly critical in these cases, especially as the law is still developing. One final point we'll give you on this one, which is ADA Title I litigation. ADA Title I covers employment. And there's actually some cool stuff kind of happening in employment. There's a couple lawsuits here, but the most interesting one was recently in Massachusetts. And basically the NFB sued a software provider, and they basically said, you're a software provider selling stuff that isn't fully accessible in the NFB's view. And because you are selling this software and people are using it as part of their job, you are liable. Normally, the argument would be, I work for a company and the company bought software that's inaccessible, so the company has to make it accessible. The company held the liability. The NFB constructed this particular argument in a way where they could actually argue against the end software provider. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. It's a bit of a long shot, but kind of gets you to another point where we think over the next 20, 30 years, you'll actually see things growing, which is, does digital accessibility go from just sort of consumer-facing general use and actually really penetrate into employment as well, which we think has a particularly big potential impact.
So would you say that the impetus for companies to make their websites more accessible is driven by, I don't want to get sued, or I got 20 million customers I want to access?
I don't know. I'm on like the live stream. I don't know how candid I should be. Here's the deal. Companies initiate budget to deal with digital accessibility because they have been sued or because they can't sell their product. Hard stop. So like it is very difficult to argue for budget based on access to potential incremental spending dollars. I do think there are incremental spending dollars there. I think we as an industry have done a really, really bad job of arguing that point because we've argued it from our hearts, not our head. And we can have a robust discussion about this later on. But basically, our arguments there are not credible, is really what it comes down to. What is credible is I got sued on a lawsuit, and I don't want to get sued again because I got to go talk to my CEO, and that's a pain in the ass. I don't want to deal with that. So my general experience is that budget and change is actually allocated based on a response to legal risk or market risk, which is an inability to sell your product. Caveat, which is actually, it turns out, really important caveat. The organizations that do this really well accept that and accept the fact that they want to do it because it is good for their users, and they hold both of these seemingly in contrast truths to both be true at the same time. So organizations that really do well in digital accessibility do in fact do it because it is good for the people that they serve, and they think it is fundamentally aligned with who they want to be as an organization, and they recognize that they have to do it from a regulatory perspective. My general view is that when either of those things get out of balance, you actually don't get as good results. If you have people that say, oh, we're doing it for the good of the world and it's great, like once some hard sort of budget thing comes down, the budget gets cut. If you have organizations that just do it for the legal component, they tend to not really realize their potential, but organizations that are actually fairly self-actualized in viewing it do it pretty well. So budget initiation is from legal or market risk, but really the organizations that do it well, like they really do it because they want to do it and want to do something that's good for their users, but they also understand the business implications. So slightly longer answer.
So I remember when first social media came along, nobody wanted to invest in social media because most of the old CEOs believe that, like, kind of old and whatever, they don't want to adopt that social media. Also now the ADA technology adaptation is very expensive usually, to have an engineer to just adapt all the website. Don't you think it's kind of the same example, like how people takes longer to adopt certain technology somehow? I mean,
Yes.
despite the fact that people don't really care because it's more expensive.
So I'm going to answer that question sort of in a roundabout fashion. Accessibility, as a domain space, accessibility is probably most readily described like information security. And so if you think about the adoption curve of information security over the last 20 plus years, that is probably what will play out in our industry, basically. And essentially it went from what's information security to, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea, to now it's like, oh, if we don't get information security right, I'm going to get fired, our stock price is going to drop 10%. There are sort of massive associated impacts of that. And so the difference between that is social media is I would call that a revenue generating driver, which is how do I grow the company more aggressively, or how do I expand the footprint of my product, or how do I service more customers, how do I service more constituents, whereas this is probably going to be more driven by the actual fear component of it as well. Again, I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm just telling you that's the psychology we see actually playing out in the marketplace. With that said, again, as a domain space, like, we do look a lot more like information security than we do necessarily like some of the more classic marketing things, because we do something that's like super technical and esoteric at the end of the day. Like, we are in the code of applications and there's multiple layers that we have to impact. So I don't know if that answered your question as a bit of a riff.
All right, we've got a question from the live stream. Arya Icom. I think we're giving the industry the wrong message.
Hi, Arya. Sorry.
Hi, Arya. I think we're giving the industry the wrong message by saying they should strive to scan clean, in quotes. The top scanners are 40% complete to WCAG 2.0 AA at best. They can still be unusable in real life to people with disabilities.
Yeah, so I strongly agree with Arya on this one. So if I were to oversimplify Arya's argument, and Arya, you can yell online and we will readily go back there. So scanning clean, which I was saying is kind of a first step in the area of defending yourself from litigation, does not mean you are accessible. All that means is like you passed a spell checker. So like you could pass a spell checker by writing a document that is incomprehensible and makes no sense. So like as a rough corollary, think of it like that. Like just because the words are spelled correctly doesn't mean it's actually a good or compelling thing that you want to read. Accessibility, and I would argue your legal obligation, is actually to create something that is a good and compelling thing to read. This metaphor is going to get a little stretched, but bear with me on that one, which is to say, ultimately, scanning this site, scanning the code, is a step in the process, but you need to make sure that ultimately the site as a whole is usable, the app as a whole is usable to individuals with disabilities, and there are ways to measure that. That does not need to be a qualitative measure. There are quantitative measures associated with that.
Hi. So for people who are, for groups or companies or departments who are doing their own service website and they did their due diligence to check technically and also usability, whether they're accessible, what is your opinion on accessibility statements that they put up? Is that cover everything, or will that attract more problems?
So I would encourage you to put forward an accessibility statement that is relatively generic and invites people to have a dialogue with you. And then I would encourage you to actually pay attention to that dialogue. So just covering that in 3 parts. So relatively generic. You could try to make a claim about the level of technical standards that you conform to. there are so many ways to slice those claims that it's like it's almost counterproductive, and there's no actual legal obligation to meet any particular claim. So I would say I would go for the more general approach, which is what you want to do, which is we're striving to make our stuff accessible to people with disabilities. We have provided a degree of due diligence against relevant technical standards. WCAG 2.0 AA tends to be it. You could do 2.1, whatever you want. But ultimately, like, tell us if you have problems. And tell us if you have problems, like, invites a dialogue with the community where if people have problems, they should be able to communicate them back to you. The catch is you have to listen if they have problems. So that sounds really, really stupid, but the absolute, like, burliest situations in digital accessibility come from people have a helpline and they don't answer the helpline. So they're like, if you have an accessibility issue, email us at accessibility.whatever. And people email them and it goes nowhere. And then the only recourse left for someone is litigation, which is like insane for everybody. It doesn't make any sense. So that's a key thing, is invite communication from the population as a whole, but then you got to actually pay attention to it.
Do any of your clients actually use individuals with disabilities to test their sites? Because there's, like Paula said, there's technical accessibility and then there's accessibility. And I do website testing. I see it all the time. Technically, it's fine, but it's still not accessible.
Yeah, so hopefully all of our clients do. As part of our audit process, we offer that. I can give you a very long answer on that, but the basic one is, think of compliance broken out into 2 degrees. There's technical and functional compliance. Technical compliance is, did you meet a coding standard, which is WCAG compliance, typically. And then functional compliance is, does it actually work for people with disabilities? And there are ways you can evaluate both. What happens is, on the maturity curve, organizations should go through technical conformance before they move on to functional conformance. And again, we can have a robust debate about that if you want, but for a bunch of reasons on a development curve that makes sense. But the problem is when they stall out there and then they don't actually go on to functional conformance. The law requires functional conformance. Like, we can debate that extensively, but that's basically what you got to do. You got to be effective in how you communicate with a population of individuals with disabilities, and if you don't, you fail the legal standard. So ultimately, you do have to get there. There's a statistic on the slides which you pull, which is actually, unfortunately, only about 50% of organizations actually do testing with individuals with disabilities, which I think we should be, like, irate about. Like, that's terrible. And also doesn't make legal sense as well.
Tim, thank you for your presentation. What are the names of some of the other accessibility scanning tools that are out there?
Well, so AMP is ours, and then you can use analytics as well. There's one that's by a product called DQ, which is horrible. It's terrible. It's broken all the time. You should never use it. And then the other big one is probably Site Improve, I would say. They're another big one that's out there. They do Site Improve. And they do a couple of different scanning tools. Yeah. If you're looking for scanning tools, I would tell you not to buy a scanning tool. I would tell you to get an analytics platform. And we can have a robust discussion about this. Scanning is a horrible technology. It is not a good way to monitor websites for accessibility. You should move to an analytics platform. It gives you way more data that's way more effective. But we can talk about that separately. That's a good buy me a beer discussion. I'll tell you all about analytics.
How you doing, Tim? Are you guys actually tracking, or you know anybody that's actually tracking which types of disabilities are becoming more prevalent as the population's getting older?
Yeah, so you actually can pull really good Census Bureau data on that. I don't know if the Census Bureau breaks it out by disability type. I feel like they do, though. No, they do, actually. Now I'm flashing back to the report. They do it based on modalities, though. So they're going to do it based on, like, sensory modality types and then mobility modality types. So it might not be super fine-grained data. But, yeah, there is some data on that as well.
But are they showing which ones are more prevalent?
You can infer that from the data. Yeah, they have cohorts in it.
People with more and more conditions of different types.
Yeah.
When you go around, and so
I believe they break it out that way, but I don't know. You'd have to look at it. There's a I want to say it's like a 2015 or 2016 Census Bureau report on disability statistics that breaks it out, and then does break it out based on different modalities. There's a point at which they won't break out the data too far, but I do think it's covered in there.
Hi, Tim. I want to go back to the question about accessible web testing tools. I do web accessibility testing, and I also am totally blind. My challenge out there is finding one of the scanning/analytics tools that is accessible to me using a screen reader. And I just wanted to know if you knew of any, or anyone out there in the live stream know of any tools that are accessible to a tester that is using a screen reader.
You should use the level access technology stack, AMP. So we a variety of people on the staff, like at level access, are totally blind, partially blind, use screen readers. And so not only do we test for that as part of a development process, but we would get lit up by our own internal testers if it wasn't accessible. So not to speak, like, obviously we can't release something that's inaccessible, but yeah, so we have a lot of good data on that if you want it.
I'm just going to comment as a third party to Tim, but for me working with Tim's company, that was something that really did show up to me as a difference of, I'd worked similar long career in accessibility, and I do think that was something immediately working with his team, that there are people with all types of disabilities, they're contributing it in, and it does actually go to even thinking about this legally, the discussions we've heard tonight, definitely things that I learned from a lot of people on his team. There are a lot of things that need to be done in technology that don't necessarily fall into the technical standard or the technical view. It does come down to, people with disabilities being employed, people with disabilities giving feedback, people with disabilities having a voice, and that is something that, I totally got from working with his company, and it's something that was one of the reasons why I was like, yeah, I really like working with them, and to the point of actually having people be able to use the tools, with disabilities. That's completely something that so many companies miss, right? Like to the question here of like, well, this should be something just like everything else needs to be accessible. It's like all of these tools need to be accessible, and that was something that I definitely, saw there. So. Plug, and also just honest, I think it's rare to see that.
So you'd asked about OCR, so let's do that, and then about Department of Education. So sorry, we had just one question on this. So it's just earlier. Department of Education, OCR, Office of Civil Rights and Enforcement Agency. So to make a very long and complicated story short, so the OCR enforces civil rights in the area of education. They do that both in primary education, secondary education, etc. There was a variety of different digital accessibility lawsuits. Lawsuits is not the right word. Complaints that have been filed by an advocate named Marcy Lipset. Marcy had filed something like 2,400. Basically what happened, and you'll see sort of these complaints kind of bounce up and down. The blue chart there, which is not the best, is the number of digital accessibility complaints. So essentially what happened is a bunch of these were filed. The Department of Education last year changed a rule that basically said the Department of Education can dismiss any sort of complaint that comes for digital accessibility that has been filed by the same person more than once. Sorry, invert that. A complaint that has been filed by a person that has filed another complaint can be out of hand dismissed, i.e. if you file multiple complaints, the multiple filer rule, you're getting thrown out. So they changed that rule. They threw out a ton of these different digital accessibility issues that were out there. The case database dropped. The National Federation of the Blind, I have to look it up, a couple different organizations, like it was like NFB, AFB, a few other ones, actually sued, and they sued the Department of Education. They were like, you can't change the rules arbitrarily like that. You have to go through a structured process, which I think is the Administrative Procedures Act. So they're like, that's correct. Like, you actually have to do it. You can't go through this, just arbitrarily change the rules. And so they reinstated the rule. So all of a sudden you saw the cases like jump back up, basically. So we've been tracking that database. The total final on all of that is OCR enforcement dropped off materially at the beginning of the current administration. We don't know if they're going to drag their feet on these, but at least the complaints will stay in there. And so we expect you'll still see a bunch of actions from the Office of Civil Rights enforcing things. I can tell you that the number of settlements has continued to grow over a period of time as well.
Does that number include private institutions?
Yeah, private, public, doesn't matter. So Title II, Title III. There's a longer sort of component of that, but yeah, they should have statutory oversight over both.
Now, is your product
The best ever. Yeah, totally.
in addition, is it a scanning tool or an analytic tool, and how does it compare to like Axe and WorldSpace in terms of false positives?
Right. So, think about the universe of digital accessibility tools split into kind of pre-production and production tools. Pre-production tools will scan in continuous integration environments, content management systems, things like that. Production tools will monitor production websites, and those are analytics packages or scanning packages. So both like Level Access and DQ will have similar products. On the pre-production side, Axe is a freely available open source tool. We have a freely available closed-ish sort of tool called Continuum that basically is there. So you can pick Axe, it's free. You can pick Continuum, it's free. We don't care. You pick whatever you want. Testing coverage is going to be similar. We can tell you why our testing coverage is better. We have this analysis, etc. You're going to get 5 or 7% more coverage on it. I'll give you one comment on that in a second because I'm going to say something horrible, but it's kind of funny, I think. That's on pre-production side. On the production side, you then have two options. You have scanning tools, which are web spiders that go out and crawl around. And then you have analytics packages, which are JavaScript that sits on a site and then tests a site for accessibility. Mm-hmm. The JavaScript approach gives you like way better data and is 1,000 times easier to deploy. The scanning tools are old. We have scanning tools. You can buy them from us. You can buy them from DQ. We have, as of 2 years ago, decided we're not going to invest in that anymore and really focus in on the analytics tool. The analytics tools work across every single time the page is loaded, across every single device, across every single browser. It is aware of the traffic that you have. It is automatically updated. You do not have to record scripts. It works behind firewalls. It works in front of it. Like, it's 1,000 times better technology than scanning. And then you can also take that data and actually put it into systems. But the punchline on all of that is our tools are better and DQ's tools are terrible. No, just kidding. DQ is a good company. They do some good stuff, but we have a little bit more of an integrated stack.
Hi. Thanks for everything. So I'm a bit new to this space, and I think it was mentioned earlier just about the types of disabilities that are covered when it comes to scanning and when it comes to legislation around this. Can you explain just a bit about the nature of the different types? I'm thinking kind of the differences between physical disabilities, like being actual, like kind of partially blind or blind, compared to learning disabilities and other type of like psychological disabilities that impair like your comprehension, other things like that, of certain forms of information, whether it's kind of dyslexia where you switch letters around and other types of kind of solutions that target those types of disabilities. I'm just kind of asking more generally about the space.
Yeah, so drastically oversimplifying. Disability, impairment of a life function. You could argue it's a major life function, minor life function, whatever. Impairment of a life function is an easy way to define that. Easy ways to classify disabilities, and then I'll tell you why that's totally impossible. Sensory disability, impairment of the 5 senses. Mobility disability, impairment of an axis of motion. Cognitive disability, impairment of the cognitive process. Speech disability, impairment of the speech process, but producing speech, generally speaking. With that said, like, people with disabilities are people. Like, they're as infinitely varied and changed as all of us, and the manner in which their abilities are different or modified, or like, it's just always different. So the taxonomies can be useful in terms of determining how you actually want to deploy technical solutions. But the one thing I would like really strongly stress is it's all about people at the end of the day, and can people do stuff? And if people can do stuff, that's accessibility. So that's kind of how we split it out, though, if you think about those broad taxonomies. Without getting too deep into the technical details, the technical standards have gone through a pretty solid process of looking at those different types of disabilities that are commonly prevalent and looking at the technology that is commonly prevalent and figuring out what is a set of requirements that impacts the broadest set of users with disabilities. So if you look at like the WCAG process is actually quite robust in terms of determining what's in, what's not in, and how that factors out across various different disability types. Types of disabilities shifted then over time as well, I think from an awareness perspective, I would say, not from a population perspective. So as an example, WCAG 2.1 has more for individuals with cognitive disabilities than was potentially present in WCAG 2.0. That was something that they wanted to build in. So kind of technical standards, if you're starting at a base level, the technical standards actually have considered a lot of that stuff. As you get more advanced and you get to a more nuanced view of accessibility, then you would start to bring in user testing. And you basically have users with various different types of disabilities actually just testing stuff and seeing if they can get done various different tasks on it. The only final point I would put on that is there is a fascinating intersection between types of disabilities you would not think are in any way correlated. So people that are blind use screen readers and people that have dyslexia use screen readers. And that may not be like intuitive because one person has a complete visual context, one person does not have a visual context, but the technology is totally the same and has as radical and positive an impact on people's lives. So we do see a lot of like correlations or sort of mergers, if you will, between those various different things, which get you back to the technical standards that have kind of accounted for a lot of that.
Sure, thank you.
Right.
Thomas, it's about 8:15. You want a break?
We're very close.
Close.
We got one last one from our
is it.
live stream. This is our last one.
Let's do it!
And it's Aria ICOM again. All right. Great. What about documents on these websites? What have you found about enforcement of accessibility on the PDFs and other formats? So just getting into other things than just web.
Yeah, so enforcement of accessibility of digital documents, it's a mess. It's virtually impossible. There are not great systems to do it. You could try to do it in a content management system. It doesn't work particularly well. You can try to do it in post-market products. There's a couple post-market products, varying degrees of success. You can try to do it in Adobe, varying degrees of success there. There aren't really great solutions for that. And the problem that we sort of cite with digital documents, we always call like the adjunct professor problem, which is really to say like you have a website, but a website is not like a standard integral thing. I have like hundreds of people that are posting content to this website, potentially thousands, and those people barely know how to operate Microsoft Word, let alone how to make a Word document accessible. So like it's a really, really difficult problem to try to get them to all make documents in a standardized fashion, let alone an accessible fashion. There is some stuff we do on the scanning side, actually, less so on the analytics side, interestingly enough, that does scan documents for accessibility. So there are some good automated checkers out there, but the solutions on automated document accessibility still need they need to make like the next great iteration. I was going to say great leap forward, and I was like, that's a terrible thing to say, Tim. Don't say that. But like they need a big leap forward in terms of the technical efficacy there. But mostly they're ad hoc solutions. There's no really good, consistent approach right now.
Great. Well, all right. Let's give Tim a round of applause. Thank you, Tim. And again, thank you everyone for coming to the meetup tonight. We'll be basically around here for probably next 30 minutes. We definitely need to get, out of here in about 30 minutes, but there's some time for Q&A and hanging out afterwards. Really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Again, want to thank our sponsors, Level Access, CEO right here. Want to thank sponsors Adobe, and also want to thank the sponsors of Thoughtbot, which is the space that you're in tonight. So we will be having events in May and June. Stay tuned on the Meetup page. Stay tuned on the YouTube, Twitter. We will post those announcements out. And as always, if anyone here in the room tonight is interested in presenting or has a community event that you would like announced out to the New York City community, you can message our group. You can get connected with our group, but we also seek to help promote and make people in the city aware of other events that are going on in the city. Thank you everyone for coming tonight, and let's network.